Hello, everyone. We're going to be talking about perfectly competitive markets this week. As a starting point for that, we're going to talk about market power in general and competition. We're going to talk about perfect competition and put that in the context of, different types of markets with different degrees of competition. Profits under perfect competition, and then a few other considerations at the end, as well as the policy implications of this model. So, to start out, market power. Market power is the ability to control or at least affect the terms and conditions of a market exchange. Generally speaking, we think about this in terms of pricing power. The classic example here is, Standard Oil, Carnegie Steel, railroads. But this is becoming, the degree of competition in markets is becoming more and more important day to day in our contemporary era with large and powerful firms such as Amazon that have a virtual monopoly on large swaths of consumer products. Before we dig into kind of an economist view, let's think about how individual actors in the economy kind of feel about competition. For a business, competition is generally bad for profits. It means that consumers have more alternatives, and so a lower price must be charged as a result if there's more competition. Consumers generally like competition because it helps to keep prices low. But people don't exist only as consumers, we also exist as workers and as citizens. And competition can have a large number of positive and negative side effects. One negative side effect is that increased global competition leads to job outsourcing, which is bad for some workers, but good for consumers. A positive aspect here is, for instance, Bell Telephone is an example I really like for this. They were able to invest in very long-term things, basic technology through Bell Labs, that a more competitive firm could not have, and that eventually benefited society as a whole. This is in large degree dependent upon how well any given monopoly is regulated, but we'll talk about that more next week. And finally, economists generally have a very positive view of competition. Thinking back to our welfare analysis chapter, economists very much care about the size of total surplus, and so competition generally increases the size of the total surplus, increases efficiency. Economists like it. So, just keeping all of that in mind, let's talk about perfect competition. So perfect competition is a market for the exchange of identical units of a good or service in which there are numerous small sellers and buyers, all of which have perfect information. It is a kind of idealistic market that doesn't really exist in reality. A example that is often used for perfectly competitive markets are agricultural markets. For instance, the market for wheat is a largely identical product that once upon a time had many small growers, but this is less and less the case in contemporary times. Another common example that's given for perfectly competitive markets is low-skill labor markets. But once again, more contemporary research has shown that there is actually a great deal of market power there. And so more and more, it seems to be the case that perfect competition is not something that exists in reality, but it's merely an idea that we can use to orient ourselves on this kind of spectrum of competition. The concept of perfect competition comes with a set of assumptions that must be met for a market to be perfectly competitive. First, there must be numerous small sellers and buyers, and importantly, none of these buyers can make decisions that are impactful enough in the market that it would alter the prevailing price of the commodity. So if we think back to like an older age where we did have a bunch of small family farmers, each individual farm produces such a small proportion of the overall market for wheat that the individual actions of a single farmer will have essentially no effect on the price of the commodity at the end user. Second assumption is within any particular market, only one kind of good or service is traded, and all units of the good and service offered for sale are identical. So the idea here is that will mean that buyers will not care which firm they buy from and will make purchasing decisions solely based on price. And so just no product differentiation. Third assumption is that producers of the good or service can freely enter or exit the industry. So there are no barriers preventing new firms from joining the market or preventing existing firms from leaving the market. This is a sticky assumption because oftentimes there are significant barriers to entry, sometimes legal, but also sometimes material. For instance, a new firm might need a large amount of machinery, and that is a barrier to entry just as much as legal prohibition or licensing is a barrier to entry. And finally, buyers and sellers are also assumed to have perfect information, so they all know where the good is available, how much of it's available, at what price it's offered, and what the potential profit of selling this good will be. So people have this kind of perfect foresight going on. And so if you sit and think about these assumptions, they are quite strong. And this is one reason why it is very difficult to argue that perfect competition in any way prevails in the real world. One way that we model perfect competition is with the idea of a price taker. So if you look at these two graphs, I've got a graph for the overall market and for the individual firm. The overall market looks just the same as it does in all of the previous models we've done. But because the individual firm is so small, their demand curve that they face is perfectly elastic. So in consequence, what this means is if the individual firm attempts to charge just $1 more than their competition, they will sell 0 units of their product. And there's no incentive for the firm to charge less than their competition because they can sell as much as they want at the prevailing market price. And that the way that we model that is with this individual firm level, perfectly elastic demand curve. We should think about perfect competition, way on this side here, as being the kind of extreme case of the most competitive a market can be. And in next week, we'll talk about departures from perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. And so as we move further and further to the right, we're seeing less and less competition. And so most markets lay somewhere in the monopolistic competition or oligopolistic areas, rather than one of the extreme cases of monopoly or perfect competition. In perfectly competitive markets, since any individual seller doesn't have any effect on the market price, we can assume that price is equal to marginal revenue, which makes sense given the individual firm's demand and supply curve, which is just the same thing as marginal revenue, which is equal to P star. It's perfectly elastic. Keeping that in mind, the total revenue, TR, of any firm that is perfectly competitive is always the prevailing price in the market times the quantity they sell. So there's P times Q. And so the total revenue curve, so TR, increases linearly with the quantity sold. It's going to look something, should be from the origin because it's 0 quantity, total revenue is also 0, but it's just going to be a straight line. So if they sell 100 bushels of corn, that's going to map to one specific total revenue level. And if they sell twice as much corn, then they're also going to make twice as much revenue. In a perfectly competitive market, actually makes 0 economic profit. So all the firms in this market seek to maximize their profits, and in doing so, no one makes any. Accounting profits may persist. You have to be able to cover all your bills, keep the lights on, but economic profits should be 0. And so at this level, participants in this market are being compensated just enough to continue participating in the market. And this is largely a consequence of thinking about this kind of stemming through time. So suppose that positive economic profits do occur. Think about for a moment and go back to those assumptions of perfect competition and think about what the consequence of positive economic profits would be. If there is a higher than zero economic profit, that will draw additional entrants into the market. And in perfectly competitive markets, there are no barriers for them. So you'll get more and more people in, more suppliers. That will erode those positive economic profits because there will be more competition among competing suppliers to lower the price. And so through this dynamic of entry, you actually have a reduction in the profit rate back to the economic profit rate of 0. Suppose that rather than having positive economic profits, you've got negative economic profits, so people are actually not being compensated for their opportunity costs. If that's the case, there are likewise no barriers to exit, and so people can freely leave the market. And so in that way, positive economic profits or negative economic profits cannot persist for very long. For perfectly competitive market equilibrium, it's a little, it involves this kind of long-run sense where economic profits of each individual seller are 0 and there's no incentive for entry or exit. Under these circumstances, they're assumed to be making a normal profit. That is, a profit just enough so they are compensated for their opportunity costs. So I've got 2 tables here. This first one will probably look a bit familiar to you. So let's assume we have a farmer who's deciding how many bushels of wheat to produce. The way that the farmer is deciding this is by selecting the amount of fertilizer he will apply to his field. So on this furthest left-hand column here, we have number of bags of fertilizer. We've got the resulting yield per acre. Fixed costs, this would be the farmer's tractor and land and what have you. Variable costs, which in this instance we're assuming only to be the bags of fertilizer. We sum those fixed costs and variable costs up to get total costs. Total revenue is just the quantity of wheat produced multiplied by the price. In this case, the price is equal to $4. So, for instance, this first row, 100 bushels of corn are produced times price of 4 yields to a total revenue of $400. And we can do that for every row. We can then subtract total cost from total revenue to arrive at our profit. And if we just go down the column on the right, we see that this farmer's profit is maximized at 6 bags of fertilizer, which corresponds to 154 bushels of corn per acre. So you'll notice here, this farmer is making a positive economic profit of 26. So in this specific instance, this producer is not perfectly competitive. But we'll work through this exercise all the same. So over on this next table here, we've got the marginal product of each additional bag of fertilizer. So the first bag adds 15 more bushels of corn per acre, 12, 10, 8, diminishing marginal productivity of inputs. We've got a fixed cost per bag of fertilizer, and over here we have our marginal cost per dollar of corn, and the marginal revenue per bushel of corn. And so the way that we arrive at this over here is the cost divided by the marginal product, and that gives us the entries in this column here. And so if we go down and we think about this as the farmer, okay, I'm going to apply the first bag of fertilizer. Well, the marginal cost per bushel of corn is $1, but the marginal revenue for that bushel of corn is $4. So the farmer's going to apply that bag of fertilizer. And then they look at the next, $1.25 compared to 4, okay, cool, and so on and so on. And then finally we get down to 6, and yes, the marginal cost is less than the marginal revenue, so that means that profits are increased by applying that bag of fertilizer, so the farmer's going to do it. But we see for the 7th bag, the marginal costs are greater than the marginal revenues. So just like any firm, this farmer is going to increase output in this instance by applying additional bags of fertilizer, until marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Or in this instance, since we're dealing with these kind of discrete units, the farmer's going to continue to produce units up until marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, right? They're going to stop short of that point. And so we can look at these things, these concepts graphically as well. Over here, in this graph, we've got a total cost curve, this upward sloping, got this kind of curve shape, and we have this total revenues curve. And so these are total curves, not marginal curves. The vertical distance between the total cost curve and the total revenue curve corresponds to the profits that firm is making at any given level of output. For instance, here at about like 155 bushels of corn, this distance is profits. Now, maybe as a question I leave to you, imagine you're to the left of this intersection over here. What does the vertical distance between these two curves to the left of that intersection represent? But if we find the marginal curves instead, so these are marginal costs divided by revenue, corresponding to what we had up there. Marginal revenue is fixed at the price of corn at 4, and the marginal cost curve is going to be increasing as we move from left to right. We made it a little squiggly here just because that corresponds to our specific example. And eventually that marginal revenue curve and marginal cost curve are going to cross. And that also corresponds to the quantity of corn that is profit maximizing, which will also correspond to the quantity of corn that has the greatest gap between the total cost and total revenue curve. So in this example here, because this farmer is making a positive economic profit of 26, if we assume this market to be perfectly competitive, then there's going to be entry into this market. But finally, our usual rule for profit maximization is that we continue to produce until marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. However, under perfect competition, this rule still holds true, but we can also state it equivalently as price is equal to marginal cost. And so if the producer continues to produce until marginal cost is equal to price, then it will also be profit maximizing in this scenario, but only under perfect competition. Market feature that limits the degree of competition is network externalities. So a very kind of close to home example of this would be something like your electric company, right? It's a natural monopoly in that it is a service that is most efficiently provided by a single provider in a local area. And this is one reason why we see that local utilities tend to be heavily regulated. But another common example here is, for instance, operating systems. The reason why there are only 2 or 3 widely used computer operating systems is that it is more efficient whenever people are able to use a program over many different computers. Likewise, people that are developing software don't want to develop software for an OS that only has a handful of users. And so this is the idea of network externality that, for instance, is why Windows is so dominant. Going back to something we talked about earlier in this lecture, we should talk about perfect competition and social welfare. Markets that are in competitive equilibrium maximize total welfare. That is the sum of producer and consumer surplus. But this is not going to be the case under less competitive conditions. So even if we have all of the assumptions of perfect competition met, we may not see a maximization of total social welfare. So even if we have something resembling a perfectly competitive market, it may not maximize total social welfare if certain other conditions aren't met. So we first of all have to assume away any positive or negative externalities associated with production and consumption of the good and service. Because, for instance, a good that generates a negative externality is going to be overproduced by a competitive market, and a good that generates a positive externality is going to be underproduced by a competitive market. We also have to very strongly have this perfect information assumption met. And the more you dig into that, the more difficult that is to impose on reality. For instance, people need to have a really great idea of how much utility they will gain, the marginal benefit of consuming the good. And oftentimes, people are not in a good position to judge that, even about their own preferences. Wrapping things up here with the policy implications, we need to keep in mind that essentially no markets are perfectly competitive. It was believed that many markets were competitive or close to perfectly competitive in the past, but more and more research has shown that there is a greater and greater degree of market power that we are experiencing in the markets that we interact with in our daily lives, especially in the contemporary era. So we must be cautious about basing any policy on the conclusions of a perfectly competitive model. As always, we should try to make sure we're using a model that most reflects the aspects of the market we're looking at. Perfectly competitive markets are quite rare. So you may be asking then, why are we even looking at this? Well, it gives us one point to orient ourselves as we start talking about the more complicated models where competition does not prevail. Economists generally assume that any movement in the direction of increased competition will increase total welfare, but we should also consider these other consequences that I previously talked about, including the distributional effects. So, conclusions. Market power allows economic actors to alter the terms of market exchange, usually through price or quantity. Perfect competition is an extreme case where no individual buyer or seller has any market power. Perfectly competitive markets have firms that are price takers that make zero economic profit. Economists generally assume movement towards perfect competition increases total social welfare, especially if we have a number of these assumptions met, particularly no externalities. And as always, we should be cautious about applying the model to situations where it doesn't fit. And hopefully next week, I will give you some models that fit a lot more situations that we see in the real world. All right, so that's all I got for this week. Thanks.